Welcome to the channel. My name's Stu and this is a story about returning to play electric guitar after putting it down nearly 40 years ago and the lessons learned to get up to speed with the many changes in the music industry when looking to purchase guitars, amps and pedals. So do check out the previous videos. I'm sure you'll find them interesting. So for those of you who've been following my journey back to playing, writing and recording after a 40-year hiatus, you'll have seen that the Stratocaster was and still is my guitar of choice when it comes to just simply sitting back and enjoying the moment. And today I have a number of Stratocasters and I have them for different reasons, and each model has its own unique feel and tone. And there are of course many videos out there of folks comparing Strats of all types. But if anyone here would like me to do some comparisons, you can comment below and I'll see what I can do. However, there was a particular guitar that captured my imagination at 14 years of age. Not long into my introduction to the electric guitar, I'd been playing for a few months, and a very talented chap who was teaching me guitar, he was giving me a crash course in the fundamentals of blues rock chords and scales. He invited me to visit a local music store where they were expecting a small delivery of used guitars. Now, back in the mid-70s, there were, of course, there's no access to internet, no mobile phones, no social media as such. And while Edinburgh may be the capital of Scotland, if you wanted to know about guitars and gear in general, you really needed to ask around and connect with those in the know. Because back then, travelling to the likes of London, where most of the action was a really big deal and quite an adventure for a kid still in school. So learning about gear was not a quick process. And while I'm sure there were folks around that would be considered gear geeks back in those days in my kind of neighbourhood, but nothing like the fascination for everything guitar that you see on social media channels today. So I followed my guitar teacher into the store and we were directed towards the manager of the instrument sales, who in turn he led us to a corner of the shop where a large packing crate lay, and the lid was already loose on top of the crate, and the chap proceeded to lift out the first guitar, and it was a white Les Paul, and I remember it well because this was my guitar teacher. That was his dream to own one, and he was anxious to see this, and he immediately sought to work out a deal to purchase it. Now, I didn't really know much about Les Pauls in those days, but I do remember the shop wanted a lot of money for it. Now, while the two men were deep in conversation, I went over to the box, and there, lying on top of the packing material, was an unusual guitar that immediately got my attention. I knew right away what this guitar was, and I had recently purchased an album of a guy whose style of playing I really enjoyed, and I had a poster of him on my bedroom wall with this model of guitar. Probably the best known player for this type of guitar, the late Johnny Winter, brother of Edgar Winter, who I also enjoyed listening to at that time. Now, the store manager saw me transfixed, staring at this fabulous Gibson Firebird. And he removed it from the crate and he put it into my hands. And he kind of said to me something like, "Do you like this?" And I said, "Wow, you bet. What a guitar." Now, it would have been an early 60s model. It was well worn and the tobacco sunburst finish was really faded, while the little Firebird logo on the pickguard was partially rubbed out. Here I was standing in a guitar showroom that sported a selection of shiny brand new guitars, and yet this old slab of wood, which had clearly been around the block many times, just captivated my interest. And I asked the price, and I don't recall what the salesman said to me, but I do remember my heart sinking because I knew I could never afford this instrument. And so I shut it out of my mind and just put it back into the crate. A couple of years later, at some point in the 70s, Gibson had done a rerun of these guitars along with the Thunderbird bass, and the bassist in our band at that time and myself, we were walking by a music shop, and we would see two of these models sitting side by side in the music store window display. And we just thought how cool it would be if we could both have these. But dream on. So, you know, during my time playing the general rock band circuit in Scotland, that would be back in the 70s and the early 80s, you know, I never did come across anyone using the Firebird. Now, I'm sure someone did, but I mention this to say that it was just not a guitar that you expected to see, or certainly not in that neck of the woods anyway. 45 years later, and I get the chance to own one of the new 2019 reissue models, and when it arrived, the first thing you notice is the very large case that it comes in. Of course, lifting the lid brought a big smile to my face because that memory of being a young lad in that music store came flooding back. The 2019 version does differ a little from the original 1963 release. Notably, the headstock is a little different in design. The banjo-style tuners have been replaced with small machine heads, and of course the classic vibrola tremolo is not fitted. If you're prepared to pay the custom shop prices, then you can get a replica of the 1963 model from Gibson. I just wasn't prepared to spend that kind of money. The Firebird uses mini-humbuckers and is often touted as a Fender Telecaster on steroids. It's not a guitar for everyone, I suppose, much like the V-shaped and Explorer-shaped guitars are not everybody's cup of tea either. And having in the distant past owned a Flying V and a Destroyer, which is a kind of Explorer rip-off, and really not getting along with them, you would have thought that the Firebird would have had the same effect on me. But no, I find it very comfortable to play. You just need to hold it in the best way that suits you. There's nothing much to say about the guitar. It's pretty basic, very much like all the early 50s, 60s Gibsons and Fender guitars of the time. The tuning machine heads are a bit of a nuisance. They made them a little smaller than the standard size on guitars because of a lack of space on the headstock. So tuning can be a bit fiddly, particularly if you've got big fingers. The pickups are good, but if you're the kind of player who really likes a crunchy tone, you may want to replace them with something a little hotter. But as I mentioned in my previous video talking about relic guitars and guitars in general with finish damage, I mentioned how I'm not bothered if a relic guitar gets a knock or a ding because you're none the wiser, and also you don't need to be too concerned about what you're wearing in case you cause some finish damage from a zip or a belt buckle or something like that. But when it comes to a perfect shiny guitar finish that gets a nick or some other blemish, it's really disheartening. Now, the Firebird arrived perfect, but within a month, I went to pick it up and noticed a chip in the nitrocellulose finish. And how that got there, I've got no idea. And then I noticed this. The lacquer had cracked on some of the wing joints. What can you say? Well, anyway, Yes, this type of guitar from yesteryear would also be at home with a relic type finish, and it'd certainly not look out of place. But I purchased it flawless and wanted to keep it that way. However, moving on. There was one thing missing for me, and that's a tremolo. And in a previous video, I put a tremolo onto a Gibson ES339. So quick disclosure, I'm not sponsored or paid by anyone to review any product that I mention. My opinions, okay. As before, the unit in question is manufactured by a German company, Duesenberg. The tremolo in question is the Les Trem 2, which comes in 3 different plated versions, gold, chrome and nickel, both in right and left hand models. And the distance between the stud inserts at the stop tailpiece is 81.5 millimeters. Now, taking the unit out of the box, we have the Trem unit, a pack of stop tailpiece screws. These are imperial and metric, and washers to act as spacers, a tremolo arm and fitting instructions, and removing the strings from the guitar, the stop tailpiece and the stud screws. This is a good time to clean down your guitar if it's grubby, and give the fingerboard a lemon oil treatment, perhaps polish the frets. Now, a quick reminder, particularly on Gibson guitars, when you're laying the guitar down, do be very careful not to stress the headstock. Now, I'm doing this work with the guitar in the case as it's perfectly supported, and as you can see, I can run my hand underneath the headstock here, so no damage can be done. You take the stud screws provided, and they have provided different threads to suit various model types, so choose the correct ones for your guitar and thread them lightly into position to check you've got the correct ones, and then also clear any roughness on the threads and then remove them. Now, I have to say with this that I did have a little messing around to do because it was a real tolerance fit with the unit. So sometimes you need to take care with this. I didn't have any problem with the 339. The Firebird has a level body surface, but you don't want to clamp the unit directly down onto the guitar body, as it will cause damage to the finish, and that's what the washers are for. And here you can see me running a feeler gauge under the unit. It's always a good idea to make sure you guide the screwdriver blade with your other hand to stop the blade slipping and scratching the surface of the guitar. Fit the tremolo arm through the slot, do a general adjustment to suit, and tighten the grub screws with the Allen key provided. Check the spring action to make sure of free movement. And now it's time to restring the guitar. In this case, I'm using Ernie Ball Super Slinkies 09 to 42. And it's good practice to make sure that you minimize binding on the strings at the nut. And here I'm using a product called Nut Sauce, which is a formulated lubricant. Now, some people use pencil graphite, but do be careful not to use certain products that will actually solidify or become sticky over time. In some cases, it may be necessary to replace the existing bridge of the guitar with a suitable roller bridge. And I spoke about that on the ES339 video, so do watch that as I go into more detail. So, to finish, I'll play a few chords to let you hear the different responses to a given tremolo action. For those of you who'd like to know how things were recorded, in this example I'm using a Sennheiser mic, an MD421, a Series 2, and I prefer this as it has a slightly warmer feel to the popular Shure SM57 that often gets used. Placement is usually either at the edge of the speaker dust cap or in the middle of the cone. So testing the mic across the speaker should determine your own preference. Dual miking, of course, is very popular in recording studios. So the MD421 is set about an inch from the speaker cloth, which in turn is plugged into a mixer, which in turn is plugged into the camera, which records at 24-bit 48 kilohertz. To add room tone to the recording, I use my vocal broadcast mic. It's a Sennheiser MKH50, which has a slightly warmer feel, and that's just pointed up towards the ceiling. So finally, to answer some common Les Trem 2 questions, and particularly as it's fitted to a Firebird. Are these units expensive? Well, as far as tremolo units go, and given the quality of engineering, they were relatively inexpensive, but in recent times it's best to check for today's prices, as they are more expensive now since I last bought mine, as is most things. So if you do need a quality roller bridge, this of course will add further cost. What about tuning issues? Well, particularly as you can see the bridge moving back and forth here, I've given the guitar a fair amount of whammy bar use, and the tuning, it does hold up pretty well actually. And as I find with the ES339, it can stick a little bit, probably less in this one actually for some reason. And what I'd say is you do need to bed the strings in with a fair bit of bending, and at times you might find that some strings might just snag, but as I say, the more you bed it in, the better it's likely to stay in tune. So, if you had a more aggressive approach, I think you might become a little irritated. I don't think it would hold up too well if you really went to town on this. But that's not what I do with this guitar. So that brings us to the question, do you really need a roller bridge? Well, I only use this type of guitar for certain musical styles, and the tremolo is used fairly sparingly. So personally, I won't be fitting a roller bridge. And I have read of others who have on other types of guitars, and the conclusions tend to differ. So it's a bit of a strange one. I think it's going to be down to you and your guitar style. What about the changes in tone? Have there been any changes since putting the unit on? Well, once again, like the 339, I haven't noticed anything. The sustain, it's not been affected either, not as far as I remember. So given the type of guitar that this is, why the Duesenberg and not a classic vibrola? Well, I personally really like the classic look of the vibrola unit, but I don't want to drill holes in the body of this guitar. And setting up a vibrola can also have its challenges. So do proceed with care and do your homework before committing yourself to buying and fitting a unit like that. Generally speaking, the Les Trem 2 can be easily and quickly transferred to another Tune-o-matic stop tailpiece style guitar. So that's a plus point. And all I would say is there you have it. A schoolboy dream to own a Firebird, finally realised nearly 50 years later. Not for everyone, without a doubt, but it's just such a classic, and it's so much fun to play. In the next video, I continue to investigate the valve sound, both my Fender Twin Tone Master, a digital amplifier, and the Blackstar 6L6, a hybrid valve digital arrangement. They definitely have found a place here in my studio, and I'm very pleased with them. But there was an amplifier that got my attention some time ago, but because of mixed reviews, I took a step back and bided my time and waited for price reductions. Now, with my studio equipment now in a place where I want it, it's time to look and see if a famous little valve amp that can be seen in studios around the world has any place in my studio. Or will it, like some of the mixed reviews I've watched, turn out to be a disappointment? Well, if you like the content, then subscribing and hitting the usual buttons are much appreciated. And do feel free to comment below. And of course, if you've got any questions you think that I can help you with, then I'll be happy to try and do that. So until next time, the journey continues. Take care.